At first light, the plains are a sheet of hammered copper, the grass tips catching embered sun as if every blade remembers fire. Out there, the horizon drifts like a herd, always receding, always near. Riders know that feeling, the pull of distance, the promise of speed. Before anyone called this country Texas, New Mexico, or the Staked Plains, there were people who understood this ocean of grass as a living map. They called themselves Nʉmʉnʉʉ, the people. We know them as the Comanche. Their beginnings do not lie here, but farther north in the mountain-and-basin world of the Shoshone. Linguists hear it in the cadence of the words. Elders held it in the memory of stories. From a common Shoshone stock, the Comanche language remains so close that it still braided the past into the present. What turned a Shoshone offshoot into the Comanche nation was not a single battle or treaty, but an animal, the horse that cinched new power to old skill. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, as horses slipped from Spanish corrals into native hands and into native worlds, a people on foot learned to live at a gallop, and the southern plains would never be the same. Picture that transformation, a child barefoot in dawn dust, reaching for a rope, a year later guiding a shaggy pony with knees and breath. Later still, lying along a horse's flank while arrows whisper from a short, sinewy bow. The Comanche perfected a riding style that fused person and animal, so that the horse became a shield, a partner, a compass. They drew the bow low and quick, sending a shaft from under a horse's neck, the body itself a living barricade, then a second arrow and a third, before an enemy could ram a ball down a hot barrel. It wasn't just skill, it was doctrine, a way of making war that matched the country, strike from distance, scatter, reform on the wind. Out of this marriage of muscle and grass rose a political geography that outsiders struggled to describe. Some called it a domain, others a sphere, and in our time historians have debated the word empire. Labels aside, Comancheria was real, elastic, and enforced by hooves. It ran roughly from the cross timbers westward to the Pecos, and from the Arkansas River down onto the Edwards Plateau, swelling and contracting with seasons, alliances, and the fortunes of war. It was not a country of walls, but of routes and relationships, water places memorized, buffalo paths known like prayers, friendly camps marked in the mind. Mobility shaped everything. Camps rose and fell with the year's wheel. Warm weather hunts, autumnal meat drying and marrow boiling, wintering in sheltering canyons where the wind broke against red stone. Bands, Quahati, Noconi, Yamparica, Katsoteca, Penateca, were kin nets more than bureaucracies. Leadership rested on earned authority, a chief who fed the poor and kept the peace, a war leader whose luck and judgment drew men to his lodge, an old woman whose counsel carried the weight of remembered seasons. Horses were wealth and weapon, gift and dowry, the sound of hooves outside a lodge, a sign of both danger and abundance. Trade followed the herds, and the herds followed the rain. Down from the New Mexican villages came the Comancheros, wiry men with wagons of flour, tobacco twists, cloth, and tools. Out on the Llano Estacado, in agreed-upon basins where mesquite dotted the flats, deals were struck. Cattle taken in one raid might be traded off in another language, their brands meaningless on the open steppe. The same with mules, blankets, even iron pots passed back and forth until they seemed native to the grass. It scandalized distant officials and delighted those who profited. But most of all, it made the plains into a market, knit to Santa Fe, Chihuahua, San Antonio, and beyond. These exchanges didn't make the Comanche less dangerous to their enemies. They made them more formidable. A people who can replace losses quickly, feed their horses when others go hungry, and convert captured stock into powder and lead can hold a frontier at arm's length. Spanish officers discovered this in the late 18th century when treaties meant to buy peace also fed the very power that made peace necessary. Mexican ranchers learned it when corrals stood empty after a night of thunder. Anglo-Texans would learn it too, as they pushed into cedar breaks and limestone draws whose rules they did not yet know. But before those collisions, before names like Victoria, Linville, Plum Creek, Walker's Creek, and Palo Duro cut themselves into the story, there was the prairie itself, teacher, armory, sanctuary. Comanche boys learned to read it as others read scripture, The faint ripple that means a hidden watercourse. The way wind combs grass to show the day's dry line. The brush of a horse's ear toward threat no human eye yet sees. Comanche girls learned the arts that kept nations alive. Cleansed a hide so it would not spoil, smoked meat that would carry a family through sleet, stitched a lodge skin that would turn a storm. Women managed the lodges and the economy of camp. Without their labor, no war party rides, no child grows into the saddle. Their weapons, too, fit the place. The short composite bow, buffalo sinew and wood bent to a fierce arc, could be drawn and loosed from a horse at full run, penetrating hide and homestead door alike. Lances balanced for weight, shields painted with dreams, turned aside the quick death. When firearms appeared in greater number, the Comanche adopted them, but the bow remained the language of the hunt and the warpath, quieter and more faithful in the saddle's rhythm. All of this, the language echoing Shoshone kin, the horse teachings, the living map converged into motion. Comancheria did not harden into borders because it didn't need to. It was the space a fast people could defend, and the corridor they could punish. If a caravan pushed too far, if a rancher's remuda strayed, if a governor's promise broke faith, wheels could be taken, herds cut out and driven 100 miles into the blue. A village ringed before dawn and gone by noon. Outsiders called it savagery. Insiders called it justice. From time to time, the prairie stage brightened with parley fires. Delegations came. Spanish captains with their notebooks and medals, Mexican envoys with their papers stamped and sanded, later Texian officials with stiff collars and stiffer demands. They tended to misread what lay before them, mistaking hospitality for surrender, or taking a return of captives as the end of the story, rather than a single transaction in a larger ecosystem of power. It is easy to misunderstand a moving nation if you have never watched it move. The shadow in this story is not only fear, it is reach. The Comanche could be hundreds of riders silent as cats, a dust storm appearing on a ranch's rim. Or they could be a family circle. Laughter in the dusk, the smell of coffee and bone marrow in a pot, horses cropping quietly just beyond the fire's smoke. It is both at once that makes the memory of their world so strong, the tenderness of domestic life inside a ring of iron discipline and readiness. A people that holds those things together can grow across a plain faster than any surveyor can catch. By the early 19th century, Comancheria was a fact that every neighbor had to reckon with. Maps tried to fix it, but the Comanche fixed maps instead by choosing when and where to be seen. They showed up to trade, to threaten, to make promises, to keep score. And because their power rested on something as ordinary and miraculous as grass, rainfall, and the tireless legs of horses, it was a power both resilient and fragile. Drought could pinch it, disease could gnaw at it, a new tool in an enemy's hand could tilt it. But not yet. On the eve of the frontier wars that would try to choke the plains in defenses, the Comanche shadow ran from the Arkansas to the Pecos and down onto the limestone country where live oak hangs its shade, an empire of motion held together by skill and memory. In the distance, another sound approaches, a language of gears and cylinders, a rhythm of 6 quick shots where there used to be one. Men in buckskin and broad hats will meet riders in painted shields, and the prairie will hold its breath to see which music lasts longer. But for now, at first light, the horses stamp and snort, the people mount, and the day leans forward into a gallop. The great story is already moving. If war made the Comanche feared, trade made them inevitable. Picture a braid of wagon ruts running out from the adobe lanes of Taos, the bells of mules clinking in the evening as a crooked procession fades toward the east. Men in patched serapes, comancheros, smell the change in the wind as the flats open like a book at dusk. They carry flour, tobacco twists, iron pots, needles, coarse cloth, a brace of muskets wrapped in oilcloth, perhaps a cask of contraband liquor with a saint's name chalked on the wood. They are not supposed to be here. Laws say one thing, hunger says another. But these men know the rules that matter on the Llano. Bring something worth the ride, keep your word, leave quickly. What they do not know is where the camp will appear, only that it will. The plains have their own appointments. By the time a Comanchero camp comes to rest in a shallow basin, stars are freckled thick across the sky. A fire blooms and the smell of strong coffee cuts the night. From the nothing dark, hoofbeats roll like distant surf. There is no surprise when mounted silhouettes materialize at the edge of light, horses slick as shadows, shields and saddle scabbards glinting for an instant. The people arrive as they always do, on their terms, from any direction, and if the meeting goes well, a market will be born from silence. This was Comanche's other warfare, the tidy arithmetic of exchange, the turning of stolen herds into powder and ball, the turning of powder and ball into more herds. Where outsiders saw contradiction, raiding by night, bargaining by day, the Comanche saw a single strategy. If the plains were an armory, trade was the trigger. It worked because of order, not accident. Camps had a rhythm that seems invisible to those who think of nomads as merely drifting. Lodges stood in rings, doors eastward, smoke holes breathing steadily, as women scraped hides into pale, finer leather, and boys fetched water in clay pots from a spring marked by willow. Herds were picketed where the grass was sweetest, watched by girls who could drop a loop around a fetlock in the blur of a heartbeat. A chief whose camp could do these things, feed widows, care for orphans, punish thieves, judge disputes without spilling blood, held real power. The horses nicker, night deepens, and the deal begins. Robes for flour, mules for cloth, tobacco for a musket that kicks like a mule of its own. There is talk of captives too, some to be ransomed, some already woven into families so completely that the old language has slipped from their tongues. On this prairie, kinship is not always a matter of birth. It is sometimes a choice sealed by the turning of seasons. The Spanish once learned this bitter and useful truth and made peace that tasted like business. In the late 18th century, officials in New Mexico figured out a simple fact. A treaty without traffic is a promise without teeth. They offered trade fairs, presents, rations, a welcome at Taos, San Carlos, and other outposts, and the Comanche in turn pledged to rein in raids, at least where it counted most. There were months and even years when the arrangement held. Horses moved west, blankets and powder moved east. Courtyards felt safer, villages breathed between alarms. The ledger never closed, but for a time both sides balanced the columns as best they could. Later, under the Mexican flag, the story changed its uniforms but not its structure. Officials alternated between outlawing the trade and relying on it. Ranchers cursed the Comancheros with the same breath that begged them for news of lost stock. On paper, the frontier was a line. In practice, it was a web of debts and favors, warnings and invitations, deals made under a sky that answered to no crown at all. The Comanche were not shopkeepers, yet they understood profit, and not only in horses. A promise kept could be as valuable as a herd, a returned captive as potent as a pistol. They knew how to stagger fear and favor so that neighbors could never quite predict which was coming at dawn. The trick was timing. Hit hard in spring when pastures fattened herds. Trade in summer when grass stretched a caravan's range. Gather and dry the meat in early fall. Then winter deep with your best horses sheltered in breaks and your worst enemies guessing wrong. It looks like freedom, this riding, but it is more exactly discipline. Freedom without discipline is just dust. Inside the lodges, the same discipline takes gentler forms. A woman checks the glue on a bow sinew with a thumb, satisfied with the pitch of readiness. An old man coaxes a song from a flute where even the pauses carry meaning. A child sleeps, curled like a comma at the end of the day's sentence. Here justice is not a tall building, but a circle of elders whose memories go back, story after story, to when a certain arroyo flooded and a hasty judgment nearly cost a life. When disputes arise, the solution aims to keep the camp whole, not to break a person for the satisfaction of the moment. It is a mistake to confuse the swiftness of Comanche punishment for cruelty. It is the swiftness of keeping a country portable. On the other side of the compass, in plazas where bells toll the hours, governors try to govern the horizon. They dispatch patrols. They draft proclamations denouncing illegal trade. They pen letters to superior officers explaining why a tight frontier leaks like a sieve. They have their own arithmetic, tax, census, levy, and sometimes that arithmetic fails where the grass begins. Farther east, in log towns along creek bottoms and oak ridges, a new polity will rise. The Republic of Texas, full of men eager to claim land with paper and a plow. They too will try to domesticate the wild logic of the plains with courthouse ink and a badge. Before there is a clear line of battle, there is a fog of bargaining. Agents and interpreters arrange parleys. Gifts move like weather from lodge to council room. Hope is drafted into speeches thick with promises. Everyone says peace with their best faces. Everyone sharpens steel behind their backs. The late 1830s become a season of almost, a diplomatic balancing act walked over a canyon. In these negotiations, the Comanche hold the strongest card of all, reach. The rumor of a war party can empty a remote rancho overnight. The arrival of a trading band with captives can draw a crowd to a New Mexican plaza faster than Sunday Mass. Even when they are not present, the possibility of their presence organizes life. To Spain, Mexico, and soon Texas, the Comanche are not just enemies. They are also partners no one can avoid. What law can do at a table, a fast horse can undo on the open ground. What a proclamation asserts, a dust plume can overrule by noon. The words people use for this frighten and console by turns. Raid, when stock is cut from a herd under moonlight. Rescate, when a captive is ransomed for coin and blankets. Diplomacy, when a gift of powder sweetens a speech. Treaty, when a document pretends to hold the wind in a paragraph. The Comanche understand all these words as chapters of one book, how to keep the people supplied, respected, and left alone on the ranges where their horses drink. This is not chaos. It is a system that makes sense as long as the buffalo move, as long as the grass keeps its bargains with the rain. Yet a hinge is creaking that few can hear at first. New settlers bring a different cadence of living, fences that creep like frost, town clocks that expect obedience from men who listen instead to the seasons. In workshops from Connecticut to Liège, metal is being coaxed into new forms, cylinders set to spin so that 5 shots answer where 1 shot once spoke. A market bigger than the plains itself is waking, and it has a habit of swallowing smaller markets without noticing. The Comanchero knows it when he sees a new kind of gun tucked against a ranger's belt. The chief knows it when a second caravan comes in a month that used to see only one. The woman at the hide rack knows it when cloth arrives so cheaply that a winter's worth of scraping is worth less than it was last year. None of this breaks the plains in a day, but anyone who pays attention can feel the temperature changing. Still, for a last, long moment, the old balance holds. Deals are made by firelight and sealed with coffee and a handshake. A herd is cut out and swept away under a scythe of moon. A Texian official drafts a letter asking for a parley in San Antonio, promising safety even as he knots the words tighter than they sound. Somewhere in the cedar breaks, a small band of men practices with a weapon that might even the odds at knife-fighting distance. The grass doesn't know it yet, but it will be asked to witness a quarrel that gifts cannot mend. The people ride on, their market strong, their families orderly, their enemies uncertain, their shadow long. The next chapter begins with a bow laid carefully beside a musket, with a distrustful smile across a table, and with a silence so tense it could snap the world in two. They met in a stone house in San Antonio, where the sun fell through small windows like bars, and the room smelled of sweat and damp leather. Outside, the plaza was bright as a knife. Inside, it was all murmurs and the dry stir of papers. The Penteca delegation had come under a white flag. Men of weight among their people, bracelets winking at the wrist, hair bound with bits of trade ribbon, and they came, as they understood it, to make peace on terms that could be carried back to the lodges. The Texans came with a different understanding altogether. They demanded something more than words, the return of every captive taken by any Comanche, of any band, at any time. How do you promise what you do not control? The Comanche world was a constellation of bands: Quahati, Noconi, Yamparica, Katsoteca, Penteca, each with its own leaders and obligations. A man could answer for his lodge and his allies. He could not command the horizon. What the Texans brought into the room to sway the balance was a girl, Matilda Lockhart, gaunt, scarred, her story written on her skin, stood as a living grievance, and every breath she took inside that council house narrowed the space for treaty talk. She was proof, a wound that pointed. Voices rose, promises hardened into demands, and the air thickened with the kind of silence that comes before a shot. When the officials signaled their intent to hold the visiting chiefs as hostages until every captive was returned, the room exploded into movement. A knife's flash, a musket butt smashing against a jaw, pistols bucking smoke into the low ceiling. Women screamed. A chief went down, locked in a stranger's arms. What had begun as parley turned to a close-quarters brawl of bodies and gunfire, and desperate exits toward a door already filling with armed men. By sundown, the plaza stank of blood and powder, and the dead lay in a confusion of uniforms and paint. The council house fight taught a simple lesson at a terrible price. Some bargains once broken cannot be mended by documents or speeches. They must be answered in the language of the plains. The answer came on a hot wind. Word spread from campfire to campfire, across waterholes where horses blew steam and drank deep, across coulees where women scraped hides and listened with their heads bowed, across the rims where young men watched dust for signs of pursuit. This would not be a knife for a knife, a single raid for a single affront. It would be thunder. From the western reaches of Comanche, the war chief we call Buffalo Hump gathered riders, Comanche foremost, with Kiowa allies along for the long ride, and the war road tilted southeast. What does a storm look like when it's made of men and horses? It looks like a brown wall on the horizon, a rumble felt in the chest before it's heard, a pressure change that makes birds lift from mesquite as if yanked by string. It looks like a coastal town waking to find its piers lined with strangers and its warehouses broken open to the sun. They struck Victoria first, a jolt to the ribs of Texas. Shots in side yards, stock cut from corrals like cloth from a bolt, a bell tolling without anyone to pull the rope. Then the riders uncoiled down to Linville, a shallow water port where merchants kept goods meant for the wider world. Here the great raid found its emblem, warehouses bursting with cloth, canned food, mirrors, piano parts, hats and parasols, and the small luxuries that traveled by sea to the edge of a young republic. The raiders laughed to see it. Mirrors flashed along the sand like fallen stars. Bolts of fabric unfurled in the wind. Shelves turned to kindling. Citizens ran aboard skiffs and schooners and watched the town burn from the bay, smoke mingling with gulls in a white sky. A few men fired from the decks until wiser heads pushed the rifles down. You cannot shoot a storm off the horizon. Then the storm rolled north again, heavy with plunder and stories to tell. They drove a river of horses and mules ahead of them and wore out the earth beneath. Posses and militia gathered in the oaks and cedar of the hill country, hard-eyed men on hard-used mounts. And on the prairie near Plum Creek, the two lines tested one another. The Texans fired from cover and saddle both, skirmishing to peel riders from the herd, trying to seize the remuda that made the raiders swift. The Comanche spiraled and broke and returned in gusts, returning lead for lead. In the end, the raiders pushed through with much of their take, leaving those behind them to claim a victory they only half believed. Tallying bodies in the grass is a poor way to measure a war that is really about reach. The Great Raid had already answered San Antonio's treachery with a scale the frontier could not ignore. It proved that the Comanche could strike deep, choose their targets, and vanish when they wished, while the Texans could bloody the edge but not yet close the fist. Yet something else moved in the brush. Nothing supernatural, only metal made clever. In workshops far from cedar and limestone, men had cut steel into cylinders that rotated when the hammer fell, so that one trigger pull did not end a fight but started a string of them. A Colt Patterson, fragile in the field, temperamental as a mule but lethal at arm's length, rode in some ranger's belts even before the decade's middle. The weapon did not make a poor fighter brave, but it made a brave fighter more dangerous. Its true meaning only declared itself a few years later, when the ground at Walker's Creek shook under hooves, and a company under Jack Hayes met Comanche riders at a range where the old problem, one shot and then a scramble with knife or empty stock, had doomed many a man with a single-shot pistol. This time 5 quick tongues of flame answered a charge, then 5 more from a second pistol, then more when a man with quick hands swapped a cylinder and set his jaw. The rhythm of close combat shifted in a single afternoon. The Rangers learned they could stay in the saddle and keep shooting. The Comanche learned that the brief window between the first shot and the second, where a bow or lance once owned the space, was closing like a trap. Even then, victory did not move on a straight line. On the open plains where a war party could vanish into 1,000 gullies and 100 miles of sky, a repeat pistol could not conjure water, nor could it keep a horse from blowing itself empty on a hot day. But in the broken country of live oak and cedar, along creeks where rock shelves threw sound back like a drum, the new weapon taught a hard arithmetic. A man with 2 revolvers and a clear head could carve a hole through which his friends might live. A company with revolvers could meet a circling ride with a wheel of their own, less graceful, more thunder than dance, but deadly. All this technological talk might seem cold against the heat of grief, and yet the two are braided. The council house fight in the Great Raid ran on bruised honor and fury. Walker's Creek ran on the same horses the Comanche had taught the plains to love. But the fight inside the dust changed because the tools did. The people still rode like weather, still could darken a horizon and turn a town inside out with their speed and nerve. But the other side of the frontier had found a way to keep answering at the distance, where courage once had to throw itself on steel. If the Great Raid was the last pure roll of thunder from the old sky, then the fights that followed, the skirmishes of the mid-1840s, were the first crackles of a new kind of storm, man-made and mechanical, that would grind on for 30 years before it spent itself. The riders who crossed Plum Creek did not yet know they were part of a hinge. They laughed and argued and divided spoils in the red evening, told stories that made boys' eyes shine. They counted their living horses and said thanks to the ones that had carried them. In the towns they left smoking, children touched the soot on their cheeks and stared at the line where fire had licked the walls and gone higher. At Walker's Creek, men sat under live oaks and rubbed at powder burns and said very little, because they understood that saying much would sound like boasting, and boasting angers the dead. The frontier had learned 3 lessons in quick succession. Parley can become a trap, reach can answer treachery, and a cylinder turning under a hammer can bend the odds of a knife-range fight. The grass remembered all of it, because grass remembers hooves and heat and the fall of men. The shadow lengthened toward the north and west, already stretching toward a ruin on the Canadian River, where adobe walls would test courage at 2 different dawns. The Canadian River runs low under a sky that feels farther away than any other sky, and on its north bank the wind chews at old bricks as if time itself were a coyote. The place was called Adobe Walls, just a trading post once, a cluster of buildings baked out of mud, and yet twice it would become a stage where the southern plains measured themselves against new kinds of thunder. The first time was winter cold, the second summer dry. Both times the air tasted of powder and decision. In the winter of 1864, a column came feeling its way east along the river. New Mexico volunteers, blue coats darkened by frost and trail dust, Ute and Jicarilla scouts riding easy, and at their center a hard, wiry officer whose name spread like a burr across the west, Kit Carson. He was no stranger to the ways of mounted nations, and he did not come empty-handed. Behind the mules jolted a pair of mountain howitzers, stubby iron throats that coughed destruction. Against a people who fought from the saddle and out of the sky's reach, a shell that curved and burst could change a conversation. They found more than they'd expected. Far from a single village to chastise, the column's scouts glimpsed a country alive with lodges and herds, a gathering of Kiowa, Comanche, and their allies that turned the river flats into a moving city. When the first burst from the howitzers reached out and tore lodges like cloth, the defenders reeled, but only for a heartbeat. Riders poured in from every fold of land, a tide of color and motion, shields flashing, horses shrilling. The howitzers barked again, and men in blue loaded like their hands were on fire. Somewhere in that frozen light, the soldiers felt the old plains lesson reassert itself. Numbers can be a landscape. The more Carson burned, the more riders showed themselves on the ridges and in the willows, ghosting forward to pinch the column. What does bravery mean when the ground itself seems to move against you? It means wheel the guns, hold your breath steady, and make your retreat look like a plan. It means admitting that a victory written on a map is not the same as a victory under a sky full of riders. Carson, no fool, measured his powder and his options and chose to live. Under the covering bark of the howitzers, the column pulled back along the Canadian, fighting a stubborn, step-by-step action that left the flats littered with burned lodges and dead horses, the river ice stained with blood, and the memory of a people not easily pushed. The first battle of Adobe Walls ended without neat lines or speeches. The army withdrew, the defenders kept the ground, and the prairie filed the day under unfinished business. A decade later, the ground had changed without changing. The ruins still baked in the sun, brittle as old bread. The river still whispered to willows. But the wind carried a different smell. Tanned hides, sour piles of offal, wood smoke from freighted camps where new men made a living off the old thunder. Buffalo hunters had come with 50 caliber Sharps rifles, long, heavy, steady as a preacher's tone, and they were turning the southern herds into money. Day after day, the flat crack of distant shooting broke across the breaks, and day after day, the herds grew thinner. Hunters stacked hides until they made walls out of meat's memory. They boiled bones for grease. They sent carloads of what had been a nation's food and clothing toward railheads a world away. In June of 1874, medicine moved like heat in dry air. Among the Comanche and their allies, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and others, Isatai spoke of power, of bullets turned aside, of a world that could be made to flinch. With him rode a leader already making his name, neither young enough to be reckless nor old enough to be slow. Quanah Parker, the son of two worlds and a rider who knew the prairie as if he'd been born from it. The war road bent toward the old ruins, where a scatter of buildings housed about 24 buffalo hunters and camp hands, men whose hands smelled of lead and hide, and whose thoughts were rarely of politics. The night before the fight, a ridgepole inside one of the buildings split and crashed to the floor. Men woke cursing, then fell back to sleep. By dawn, the omen had a shape. They came at sunrise in a wave, lances upright, horses compressed into muscle and light, faces bright with paint. For a blink, the hunters saw the charge as a single thing, like a hawk's shadow crossing a field. Then their eyes sorted the details. A man leaning low, a shield painted with a sun, a horse with a white blaze and flared nostrils. Doors barred, barrels poked from firing slits. The first shots were pistol fast, defensive and close. The kind of fire that talks a man away from a window. Then the long rifle spoke. A Sharps does not bark so much as pronounce. It sends a message to a distance that the human mind struggles to believe. Warriors felt it as a slap where no hand could reach, the wind between heartbeats exploding into hurt. Charges broke and circled and tested, brave as any cavalry on earth, but open ground and measured sights made the killing lopsided. The hunters' bullets arrived from somewhere beyond the range of a lifetime's habits. The siege did not last long, but it lasted long enough to change lives. Quanah, speared through the shoulder by luck or destiny, lived to carry the story forward. Isatai's medicine, judged in the cruel court of outcomes, lost its luster. Hunters, astonished to be alive, told and retold what had happened, and in telling reached ears that wore officers' straps. If the first adobe walls had shown the army a nation that could not be swept aside, the second showed the Comanche and their allies a crueler truth, that rifles with reach could punish courage at exactly the place courage had always been strongest, out in the open, under the eye of heaven. Legend has it that a single shot, loosed by a hunter studying a far ridge through a borrowed glass, reached across a mile of air and plucked a mounted man from his saddle. Whether the distance was exactly measured or not hardly matters to the heart of it. The psychological line had been crossed. When the land itself is big enough to make a man feel small, a bullet that comes out of the blued horizon can make him feel smaller still. Fighting is not only muscle and powder, it is also belief. After adobe walls, belief was wounded. Behind the smoke drifted a larger, slower tragedy. The bison had been the Comanche's granary, armory, and garment. From its hide came lodges that turned storms aside. From its hump and marrow came winter strength. From its sinew came the bow's calm music. From its horn the cups that warmed a child's hands. When the herd still moved like weather, dark rivers crossing a sea of grass, a camp could trade and raid and laugh and sing without fear of the long, lean month. But as the 1870s burned on, the southern herds thinned to ghosts. Hunters took them because markets asked for leather and bone and fat. Policymakers watched and did not stop it because a hungry rider is easier to bargain with than a full one. 1,000 decisions in 1,000 far rooms conspired to do what no battlefield had done: starve the nomad's war. The effect was intimate. A woman bent over a hide understood that her labor had shifted value, that cloth could now be had so cheaply a month's scraping was worth less than last winter's. A man leading a remuda felt the distances widen between water and game, rides lengthening, horses burning through grass to find meat that no longer lived where it had always lived. Children learned new cautions: how to stretch a pot of soup, how to go to sleep on a belly that expected more. Chiefs measured out their influence in dwindling pounds of dried meat, and some looked toward the agencies with an anger they chewed like leather. The camps still rose and fell with the seasons, but each move now carried the sound of a thinning world, the hush after thunder. Even in defeat, the Comanche did not become small. They remained what they had always been: riders with the memory of distances in their bones, negotiators with a sense for terms, families who could turn a broken piece of iron into a needed tool. But the ledger had changed. When a bullet can fly from an unseen place and strike true, when a herd that fed a nation becomes stacks of hides beside a railroad siding, the math that once held a country together begins to falter. After the second adobe walls, the army did not have to invent a reason to ride. It merely had to choose a season. The columns would come down the dry forks and up the broken draws, hunting not only men but also the last methods by which the people stayed free. Caches of food, trails to winter range, the remudas that made a band fast. The ruins at adobe walls still crumble in the wind, a brittle testimony to stubbornness and change. The place is not grand. It never was. Yet twice it told the future. The first time it said, a moving nation can stand off an army if the army misjudges the size of the sky. The second time it said, courage alone cannot stop a bullet that rides a new kind of distance, and a hungry world will not keep its promises for long. From here, the road bends toward Scarlet Cliffs in a canyon where the hoofbeat's echo sounds like a goodbye. The Red River is waiting, and with it a campaign that will try to shear the people's strength where it has always lived. In their horses, in their winter stores, in the stubborn geometry of their maps made of grass. The second fight at adobe walls did not end in treaties. It ended in preparations. In army posts from the Canadians' timbered bends to the limestone lip of the Edwards Plateau, officers unfolded new maps and traced routes with calloused fingers. A plan took shape that was less a single hammer blow than a tightening fist. Columns would move from different posts in different directions, feeling for trails along the tongues of the Red River and its forks, cutting off winter range, finding villages when food was lowest and horses thinnest. No one's speech started the Red River War. It came about the way prairie fire does. Enough sparks, enough wind, and suddenly the world is burning in lines you only understand after the flames have passed. The first columns moved with the heat still standing in waves off the flats. Soldiers cinched their mounts high and tight, mules leaned into harness, and scouts, Delaware, Tonkawa, sometimes men who had lived among the people and now rode for pay, drifted ahead like thistle fluff that knew how to read sign. A good scout could tell the age of hoof prints by the spring of crushed grass, could smell a cold camp at 50 paces and know whether the fire had boiled coffee or glue for bowbacks. When the country opened to the staked plains, horizons multiplied, and the cavalry became cautious of its own thirst. A canteen can carry you through bravado. It cannot carry you through ignorance. The commanders learned the old lesson quickly. The plains wage their own war against a man who misjudges distance and water. The people watched them come. From high points without names, women shaded their eyes and counted dust plumes. Men angled remudas into draws where the wind was kinder. Children ran messages, solemn with the importance of swift feet. Bands that had been living apart, Quahati in the high, dry country toward the Llano Estacado, others closer to the agencies where annuity lines could be tasted and refused, spoke across the spaces with smoke and riders. Choices thinned. A free winter meant cached meat in safe canyons, fat horses and known ways down to water. A campaign winter meant outriders, false trails, cooking smoke checked to nothing, and sleep snatched with one ear open to hoof sounds. By September, the canyons had begun to drink the year's first tempered air, and their shadows grew longer, the way old warnings grow longer when remembered at the right time. Along the breaks of the Palo Duro, the canyon the Comanche knew not as a picture on a tourist postcard, but as a storehouse, a nursery, a door only they could find. Remnants of several villages settled for a brief rest, the way a chest settles between breaths. Lodges rose in neat patterns that look casual to eyes that do not live by order. There were travois marks on the benches where children had ridden, laughter still caught under low cottonwood limbs. There were meat racks, and parfleches stamped with belonging, and caches tucked into ledges the color of old blood. Horses fussed and cropped at bunchgrass, lifting their heads in unison when the canyon's music altered. The soldiers came down like a bad dream unfolding too fast to wake from. In the dark before full sun, scouts found a way, the kind of way a horse might hesitate to take if given its own counsel. A shale slide, a crooked path, a dare. Cavalrymen followed with the discipline of men who knew fear and could fold it into their work. A bugle would have been foolishness. Leather creaked instead. Sabers stayed quiet. Men breathed through their mouths to keep from coughing. Then light touched the canyon floor, and the first shouts rose from camp. And the narrow place multiplied sound until it felt as if the cliffs themselves were calling down the riders. The fight at Palo Duro was not a set piece of flags and volleys. It was a snatching, a rending, a cruel arithmetic done at close range. Families scattered toward hidden paths, clinging to children, trusting the old memory of a goat track that led to a bend in the creek where the willows had spared them once before. Warriors tried to buy time, darting in with rifle and bow, not to trade casualties but to bend pursuit away from the lodges. Soldiers kicked down poles, cut open parfleches, put fire to what could be burned and smashed what could not, knowing that a winter's food turned to ash is a kind of bullet. When they reached the horse herds, thousands strong, the heart that made people fast, the day's geometry drew tight. A captured remuda is a victory measured twice, once at the corral rope and once at the ledger of what a people can do tomorrow. The army pushed the seized herds out of the canyon like a river of muscle and snort, color and brands mixed to nonsense. There was, for a time, a hope among the troopers that these animals might be kept, parceled out, made to haul the army's own freight or sold off at posts where the sutlers smiled like cats. That hope did not survive the calculus of campaign necessity. Horses can be guarded or used. They cannot be both in a country that eats men who dither. So the order came, flat as a plank of wood, shoot them. The numbers made a lump in the throat, hundreds upon hundreds, roughly 1,400 by the end, maybe more if you counted the wounded put down afterwards. And the air filled with the thick, metallic taste of a sorrow larger than one language could carry. There are stories men do not boast about. Some troopers stepped back from the line when they could, pretending to check a cinch or to fix a stirrup, while another man did the killing. Others did it quickly, eyes half shut behind their lids, so the job would have fewer minutes in the world. A few, hardened by too many campaigns, flipped cylinders and told jokes that sounded like barking. One private found the horse he had admired earlier, a small bay with a crooked star, and led it farther away before raising his pistol, as if privacy could make an execution kind. When the firing ended, the canyon's echo carried the last reports up to ledges where Hawks sat. The sudden quiet was obscene. Soldiers went back to work with the manic efficiency of men ashamed to be still. What of the people in that hour? Grief is not a pageant, it is a narrowing. A mother counted her children by touch in a juniper shadow, biting her knuckle to keep from calling the name of one who had bolted in panic. A man with a fresh powder burn across his cheek ran his tongue along his teeth, as if to prove to himself he still had them, then turned to lead a few surviving horses toward a dry gulch he had hidden once as a boy. Elders, winded, kept walking because the alternative was collapse, because a fall in such a moment is an invitation to disappearance. They did not think in the terms officers used, decisive blow, enemy capacity, but they understood those terms in their bones. A nation that has lost the better part of its horses has lost the better part of its reach. A winter with burned stores is not a winter that yields easily to songs. From Palo Duro forward, the campaign was not a parade of victories for anyone, so much as it was a slow shortening of odds. Columns kept moving. Scouts kept reading the world the way bookish men read a page. This bent leaf means that. This faint ash says 2 days. This hoofcut is a mule and not a Mustang. Small fights sparked and went out. The kind of skirmishes that do not make headlines but do change lives. When soldiers found caches, they burned them. When they found lodges, they cut them up. When they found people, they aimed to separate them from the things that made freedom doable. Meat, ammunition, horses, safe places with names only the locals knew. The people broke into smaller bands to move faster and to fade better. But smaller bands also eat through what they have more quickly and have fewer hands to stand watch while others sleep. Hunger is a general who commands without raising his voice. As the cold came down, the war's logic finished its circle. Riders with proud names and tired horses looked toward agency lines with thoughts they would have spat upon not long before. To walk into a fort is not to become a different species of person. It is to admit that the mathematics of the plains have been altered beyond improvisation. When the band under Quanah Parker angled toward Fort Sill in 1875, dust from their last hard ride settled on boot toes and moccasins alike. Some soldiers pretended indifference, leaning back on benches as if men leading the last free band of a nation into captivity were a daily sight. Others looked with something like respect gone quiet. Many of the people did not weep. They had used up what tears could afford them and were saving what they had for the work of surviving new rules. Quanah did not enter like a penitent. He entered like a man who sees farther than the rest and does not like the view but will not lie about it. He would, in the years that followed, take on the strange duties of a leader in a world that measured influence with ledgers and fences, ranching, advocating, navigating the bureaucracies that had replaced weather as the principal fact of life. But in that first moment at the post, what mattered was thinner, more immediate. People laid down what weapons they still carried and held one another's wrists and looked to see which elders had made it, which children had kept their brightness in their eyes. The last war had ended not in a blaze of heroics, but in a series of decisions, each one the least worst available. And that is a kind of courage not often sung. On the plains, the wind kept moving as if nothing had happened, because wind keeps no tally. The canyon kept its red walls and its hawks. The trails paled but did not disappear. The old paths never do. And yet anyone who listened could hear that a page had turned. Hoofbeats once made the country a drum. Now railheads would do that work in a different key. The people had not ended. They would not end, but a chapter had closed with the sound of shots echoing against cliffs and the steady, terrible discipline of men carrying out an order they would remember in their sleep. The road led now not to hidden water and open winter range, but to agency books, fenced pastures, and a new map pinned to a different kind of wall. Somewhere in that altered air, a rider who had grown used to the taste of dust at a gallop slowed and learned the taste of dust at a walk. The long ride home had never felt so long. Before a nation enters the quiet of paperwork, it enters the noise of promises. In the fall of 1867, along Medicine Lodge Creek, the wind carried the blended breath of thousands, soldiers, commissioners, interpreters, traders, curious townspeople, and the delegations of the Southern Plains, Kiowa, Comanche, Kiowa Apache, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Cottonwoods fretted the sky, tents flapped, horses stood hip-shot in the low sun, and the notion of peace, newly laundered and hung on a line for all to see, snapped and twisted as if it, too, were only cloth. Commissioners spoke of annuities and boundaries in measured tones, as if right angles could be coaxed into prairie wind. The people listened and weighed each word the way a hunter weighs a hoof print. What passed here, and how long ago? Treaties are theater, but the best actors cannot rewrite the terrain. The gathered leaders knew this, and among them a Comanche voice rose clear as a creek after rain. 10 Bears, old, deliberate, his words cut to the bone, did not lace his speech with ornament. He spoke from the spine outward, of a life born on the open grass, where wind writes the day, where a man's shadow lengthens honestly across the same ground his horse drinks from. He said in language that has outlasted many flags that he did not wish to die within walls. To some ears it was poetry, to others defiance. To his own people it was simply the unbent truth. The commissioners nodded gravely, as men nod to a weather report while standing in a storm. Papers were signed, hands extended, withdrew, were wiped on trouser legs. Wagons creaked toward the agencies with bolts of cloth, barrels of flour, coffee, sugar, tobacco, payment, promise, bribe, compensation, apology. Choose your word. All of them fit and none fully suffice. For a time the machinery worked. Rations were issued. The buffalo still walked, though thinner. Hunting parties still ranged, though watched. Soldiers still patrolled, though not always far. Then the threads began to pull. Promised goods arrived late or in less than honest measure. Fences sprouted along creek bottoms like thorns. Settlers multiplied in years the treaties had imagined as breaths. Raids and reprisals resumed their old cruel duet. At Medicine Lodge, ink tried to box a living people. On the plains beyond, hooves refused the box. But even in that season of making and unmaking, the Comanche world held more than war and argument. Step away from the treaty tables into a camp at dusk. The children chased one another's shadows across the lodge skins as if catching darkness could be a game. A woman with quick hands finishes a seam and passes the work to her sister, with the professional nod of one craftswoman to another. A man warms his hands on a horn cup and checks his bow's backing by feel, not sight. Stories move like a second fire around the main one. Kinship stories, horses saved by quick thinking, a hunt turned by a cloud bank's odd shape, the time a storm set down on the canyon floor like a second earth. These are the pages no clerk has ever truly learned to copy, the chapters that keep a nation breathing between skirmishes and speeches. Along the border where cultures braided and frayed, the story of Cynthia Ann Parker stands like a knot the hand cannot forget. Taken as a child in 1836 and grown to womanhood within the Comanche lodges, she married a war leader, bore children, laughed, mourned, and chose her people. Then in 1860 at the Peace River, a ranger attack tore her back into the Anglo world that once had been hers. Those who held her up as a rescued captive never understood the depth to which belonging had rerouted her life. She did not thrive. Her grief was quiet and unrelenting. Among the children she left behind was a boy who would grow into the last chief of a free-riding nation, a man whose very body made two worlds shake hands whether they wished to or not. Quanah Parker could have become a figure for legend only, a horseman in the sunset, painted on the horizon and vanishing into song. History had different work for him. After the Red River War, he led his people to Fort Sill, not as a surrendering petitioner, but as a strategist whose map now included railheads, courts, cattle companies, and the strange new power called public opinion. He learned the grammar of ledgers and the weight of signatures. He ranched. He traveled to Washington dressed with an exactness that forced senators to attend. He argued for his people with a voice that borrowed the steadiness of the plains. If the 19th century had been a season of speed measured in hooves, the 20th would be a season of speed measured in paper. Quanah rode both. His home became an emblem. Near Cache, Oklahoma, he built the Star House, a two-story dwelling with 8 pointed stars painted on its roof, a prairie mansion that married timber and symbol, ceremony and stubborn joy. Guests from across the nation, ranchers, officers, politicians, sat at his table and ate beef and bread, while the stories of a continent's hinge years threaded the talk. Children clattered up and down its stairs. In photographs, Quanah stands in a tailored coat or a fringed shirt, hair braided, gaze level, an unarguable presence, proof that leadership can belong to a man fluent in two worlds, if not fully at peace in either. There was faith work, too, no less political for being spiritual. In those reservation years, a searching people reached for medicines stubborn enough to survive the new conditions. The Native American church, with sacrament and song, offered a road that was both old and new, a ceremony whose roots tunneled into deeper time and whose branches could bend without breaking under federal winds. Quanah's defense of that path, eloquent, pragmatic, unashamed, was a continuation of the same leadership he had offered in war councils and in Washington parlors. Choose what feeds the people's spirit, guard the right to choose it, and do not ask permission to remain yourself. Where the government's answers were rations and allotments, the church offered coherence, sobriety, responsibility, reasons to keep the fire tended in a world intent on dousing it. None of this made loss vanish. Graves grew like punctuation on the edges of agency towns. The Comanche language, once a river, narrowed in places to a creek one could step across. Children learned to stand in lines that did not bend to weather. The calendar acquired a square shape that did not understand the circle of seasons. And yet the people did what they had always done when the wind changed. They trimmed the lodge, rested the horses, taught the children. A language can be taught. A song can be remembered. A story can walk across a century on the legs of a voice. Today, in powwows and classrooms, in kitchens and council rooms, Comanche words still move air. Comanche hands still bead, tan, braid, vote, litigate, ranch, write, and pray. A nation built on motion learned the hardest motion of all, carrying its past without dropping it while stepping into a future that did not ask politely. When we look back and call the Southern Plains a frontier, we make a mistake of perspective. The Comanche shadow was not cast from the edge of someone else's world. It fell from the center of its own. Spain learned that lesson when parley required tribute as much as diplomacy. Mexico learned it when horse herds disappeared across a border more real to officials than to riders. Texas learned it when the Great Raid taught coastal towns to watch the horizon. The United States learned it in Canyon Country, where Palo Duro made a new kind of arithmetic with horseflesh and fire. And the nation learns it still when it tries to remember the West as a series of isolated heroics. The plains were never empty. They were organized by kinship, by market, by violence when needed, and by the quiet civilities of camp life that made every other thing possible. 10 Bears' words echo because they hold a question we cannot put down. What becomes of a people born to wine and distance when the world insists on walls and measurements? The 19th century offered one answer, and it was too often a cruel one. The 20th and 21st offer other answers, incomplete and ongoing. Sovereignty argued in courtrooms, language classes humming in community centers, cultural revival threaded through the ordinary work of paychecks and parent-teacher meetings, veterans' posts hung with flags that knew two loyalties and dishonored neither. The Comanche story does not end with surrender or with sentiment. It endures, sometimes loudly, sometimes under breath, always with a particular way of seeing space and time that the plains themselves seem to approve. Stand now, if you can, at Palo Duro's rim, where the red earth falls away into shadow and light in bands so distinct they look like the pages of a book laid open. Close your eyes. Hear the wind make a drum of everything. Imagine hooves braided to that drum beat, then silence braided to the hooves. Open your eyes. In the distance, a highway unspools, a new kind of trail. Somewhere down there, a child is told a story about a star in a house, about a chief whose mother was taken twice, about a speech that asked for sky, about a people who learned to ride the wind and then to live without riding it as far. You will go home carrying more than facts. You will carry a sense that the West is less a direction than a way of measuring what matters. Water, grass, kin, courage, mercy, memory. What finally does the plains remember? The thunder or the silence that followed? Perhaps it remembers the thread that runs through both. A nation riding the center of its own map and refusing to let that center be moved without a fight, then refusing to forget itself when the fighting was done. If you listen, the wind will answer in two languages and one voice. It will say, "The people are still here."